Hi, everybody. We would like to start. I'm sure more people will come trickling in. This is, after all, the session after lunch. It is to be excused if people feel, after a long morning of fascinating debates, if they're slightly slow in coming here, but we will start already. I am CONSTANZE STELZENMÜLLER. I'm a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund. And it's my pleasure and my honor to have been invited here for the first time, not for the first time to Bratislava, I'm pleased to say, but the first time to this conference, to moderate a panel on transatlantic relations in the 21st century and Central Europe. In many ways, you might say, the key question of this entire conference. And I am German, so you can all blame me afterwards. As one does. We're used to it, don't worry. I would like to lay out one or two points that I think are key here. If you've looked at the discussion notes, you might think that transatlantic relations are about Central Europe's relationship with America. Last time I checked, transatlantic relations was about the relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic. And last time I checked, Central Europe was part of the EU, which is good. We're all for that. So I think we need to slightly enlarge the picture here and speak not just about Central Europe's relations with America, but its relationships with the EU, its role in the EU, and what the American-European, the transatlantic relationship is in a day of multipolarity, of economic crisis, and of upheavals in the Middle East. Now, I would like to start with something maybe a little bit unusual, and then that'll be enough introduction from me. I'm sure you all know the Nobel Prize winner for literature, Czesław Miłosz, who in a famous series of essays called The Captive Mind, written in the early 50s, wrote an essay called Looking to the West, which begins with what I think are some both immortal and apposite words. And I would ask you, in the first sentence that I quote, to replace the word with Americans, the word Americans with Americans and Europeans in your mind. And it's the following. Are Americans really stupid? I was asked in Warsaw. In the voice of the man who posed the question, there was despair as well as the hope that I would contradict him. This question reveals the attitude of the average person in the people's democracies towards the West. It is despair mixed with a residue of hope. And on that cheerful note, I am going to turn to our first speaker, Wes Mitchell, who is the president and co-founder in 2005 of one of the Washingtonian think tanks working on Europe, the Center for European Policy Analysis, also known as CEPA. Wes is a Texan and a Republican, he's just told me. Wes, isn't it awfully lonely these days in Washington for somebody like you who works on Europe?
I'm the residue of hope.
Well, what, of course, I'm leading to is the somewhat larger question, and one which I think has been cropping up in debates previously, which is what actually is the Obama administration's attitude towards Europe and Central Europe? Does it still matter? Do they still care? What's good? What's working? What isn't?
Well, thank you for that question, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together, Robert and Radoslav. This is fantastic. I think it's the right question to start with on so many levels for transatlantic relations. And thinking of Central Europe, we've had so much ink spilled in the last several years about what's gone wrong in the relationship between the United States and the countries of Central Europe, by which I simply mean the 10 new member states or newish member states of the European Union, post-communist member states. I'd like to start maybe as the residue of hope here, on an optimistic tone, and talk about what's gone right lately and what's gone right under Obama. I think if you look at the conversation that we will have today about U.S. Central European relations, this same panel a couple of years ago would have had a very different conversation. I think if you look at the situation today, there's a lot that's good in Central Europe. I mean, Central Europe as a region has probably never been more prosperous, more politically free, or more in control of its own destiny geopolitically than it is at the current moment. The geopolitical environment is quiet. The economies are returning to growth. You've got not 2 but 3 Central European member states of the EU who are occupying leadership roles in Europe this year. You've got actually improved relations just over the last year and a half for the countries of this region, some of the countries of this region, with both the United States and with Russia. You've got broad investments by the Obama administration in the period since the catastrophe that was the cancellation of Third Site missile defense. You've got broad investments in strategic reassurance in Central Europe, especially North Central Europe, military maneuvers and forward movement on phased adaptive approach and trips to the region. by senior officials. So I think that there's a lot that's good. In some ways, I think where we're at in the storyline on U.S. Central European relations is that we're moving out of the phase that you could think of as ally fatigue. The storyline is shifting, and we're moving into a new area. You might call it the new normal. And I think that new normal as a baseline will not be as sentimental or positive as before Iraq, but it'll be better than it was at the low point with the acrimony over missile defense. Having said that, I think there are some very serious near-term challenges and some reasons to believe that this weather pattern won't entirely hold. And in rapid succession, I would just say that I think the first of those challenges is here in the region itself. I think there's a constellation of Atlanticist-minded center-right governments in Central Europe, that many of which have very tenuous holds on power, who may not be in a position of influence in the near future. And that masks the deeper reality of the strategic fragmentation and diversification that's going on inside Central Europe. The second issue that I'd like to pick up on from the last panel is the issue of Russia. And I would characterize it as the persistence of Russian revisionism. Despite all of the improvement in tone and temperature under the Russia reset, I think at the end of the day, the analysis has to be that Russia remains fundamentally a power of revisionist intentions and limited means that has, let's just say, diminishing and asymmetric power assets at its disposal, that is groping to define its role in the new international system. I've often said before, you can think of Russia as sort of a dying supernova from the previous order. It has one last starburst of energy that's not enough positive energy to do anything constructive, but enough at times to do things that are not constructive. So I think reset has helped to increase the terms for cooperation, but there's still very real issues to deal with in terms of coming up with a Western strategy for coping with that kind of power. And then finally, a connected issue is the status of the post-Soviet space. The steady rollback of reform in the post-Soviet space, post-Belarus elections and post-Yanukovych consolidation. I think that we're moving in the opposite direction in terms of political reform. So generally, I think we've seen some improvement in U.S. Central European relations over the last year and a half. Looking forward, I think the main agenda items are what you might call residual reassurance, tying off the perimeter here in a way that the combination of reset and retrenchment from Europe, I think over the long term, will continue to give us questions in the alliance about, or let's say, there may not be a military need for reassurance, but politically a need to avoid the continual crises over the need for reassurance in North Central Europe. And then the bigger agenda item, which is, in a way, Belarus and Egypt and Tunis all point towards the need for a reactivated and rejuvenated democracy agenda in the post-Soviet space and beyond.
That's something we'll get to. But I'm not sure that our Georgian, Ukrainian, Belarusian friends here would think of what is yet still needed as residual reassurance, at least on the Russian front. But I think we'll come back to that. And I will, for the moment, turn to Tomáš WALÁŠek, who is a Slovak and a board member of the Slovak Atlantic Commission, and also the director of foreign policy and defense at the Center for European Reform in London. And in that, he's like many of us on this panel, and I think also many of us in this room. He has multiple identities by now. A lot of us Europeans have spent time in other European countries or in America and come back. And I think that one of the things that we will see, not just in the course of this panel, but in the course of these days, is that it is no longer quite so easy to pinpoint ourselves and each other on European political maps and on transatlantic maps. But with that, Tomáš, let me ask you something very blunt. Is there such a thing as Central Europe? I ask because from the vantage point of the middle of Europe, Berlin, geographic middle, I hasten to add, one does get the impression that the four Visegrad countries, certainly Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, have in fact quite different outlooks on their position in Europe, their relations with America, their relationship with Russia, their attitudes thereby to the Eastern Partnership. And I could go on. They are, if anything, the closer you get to them, the closer you live to them, the more different they seem. What is so Central European about these four?
Just to pick up on your point on multipolarity, I'm also quarter German, just to cozy up to the chairwoman.
Nice try.
But is there such thing as Central Europe? Yes, there is. Geography matters, history matters. For reasons of geography and history, we Central Europeans tend to value the same things. We Central Europeans tend to worry about the same things. Having said that, it's a lot less of a cohesive a unit than it used to be. We had two overriding missions that used to bound us in the past. One was, of course, the task of getting into the EU and NATO. That's done, that's been accomplished. The other big task, of course, was continuing the business of Europe whole and free. And for a number of reasons, which I think we will get into, I hope we get into, that business is no longer as pressing, nor is it as easy or as achievable as it seemed to be a few years ago. Clearly, it's a less of a priority to the United States, and therefore the Central European-U.S. relationship has lost some of its quality and some of its vitality over the past few years. But frankly, it's a bit of a less, I don't say less of a priority to us, but I think we're a little more pessimistic on what is really achievable in terms of continuing the business of Europe whole and free. What we're realizing is that, as one of your colleagues actually, Ron Asmus, likes to say, the easy accession countries are already in the EU and NATO. What remains are the difficult ones, in a sense of the extent to which some of the nomenclatura has become steeped in its old corrupt ways, the extent to which the shared history with the Soviet Union has shaped the politics and the mentality, and also the attitudes to the West in some of the hopefully future accession countries. So, to make a long story short, the business of continuing making Europe whole and free, which used to be the key mission of not just Central Europe, but also the transatlantic Central European relations, it seems both more difficult and more and less achievable, and also less popular in Washington these days. Does it mean that we as Central Europeans now don't have anything that binds us? No, we still do. In fact, when you follow the conversations, and we'll hear soon, I think, tonight or tomorrow from the foreign ministers, they will go through the agenda, the new agenda, and in some ways it resonates as well as the old one. Energy security, obviously something that binds us when you look at how all the pipeline networks run through from east to the west. You realize there's very little in terms of interconnection between the north and south. Clearly, one of the top businesses for the Central European region these days is to make sure that we have a proper backup and redundancy in energy. And frankly, our biggest challenge going forward is going to be formulating a Central European point of view and helping to contribute to a European point of view on some of the new global challenges. That's rising China. That's obviously, for the past few weeks and months, North Africa. We've struggled with it. We would like to think that the old agenda is going to be all dominant. It won't be, and I think, frankly, one of the main weaknesses of both the Central European-U.S. relationship as well as the broader European-U.S. relationship is, frankly, Europe's inability to find its own niche, its own contribution to the new global agenda, which is, again, China, Northern Africa, broader Middle East.
Okay. I notice you've elegantly skirted my actual question, which is how much cohesion is there within the group of the four. But I think that we will get to that. In fact, I'm going to move to MARCIN ZABOROWSKI, who is Polish and has spent a substantial amount of time in France at the EU Center for International Studies, but has now returned to Warsaw as the director of the Polish Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as PISM. And Marcin, Poland, for example, is pursuing very much a foreign and security policy of its own within Europe. In fact, again, speaking from the vantage point of Berlin, and I can't deny where I come from, so I will pursue it, go on in this vein. From the vantage point of in Berlin, one gets the impression that, at least currently, while it is very much appreciated that German-Polish relations have improved a great deal, the Polish government Polish government's strategy seems to be, we want to play in the big leagues. We, Central European issues, this is something that's for smaller countries. We're a big country now, and we want to play with the Germans and the French and the Brits at eye level. There may be an element, of course, of we have to stop the Germans from doing stupid things and the French and the British from doing stupid things. That may even be true. What's your take on Poland's role in Central Europe?
Well, it's a hugely complex question. I mean, to begin with, all this notion of doing things regionally, and in the context of V4, in the context of Central European coalitions, that, as you very accurately pointed out, it didn't always worked out, but the differences between these nations have been considerable over the issues of, for example, allocation of resources, over the issues of even Eastern policy, visas, and so on. Still, as Thomas has pointed out, there is energy security. There is, I mean, look at the program of this conference. If this conference was in France, it would have been a very different program. You don't have Belarus at the first panel. You would have, Libya or Egypt.
Vacation spots for the French government.
Voilà.
Or French.
So here we certainly have similar interests. We are interested in similar issues. However, it is also true that I think after this period of trying to do things via Central European coalitions, which never really held together, the Poles are looking into various other ways of doing, of achieving what they really want to achieve. And I think it will be an increasing tendency within the EU, a sort of a coalitions of interests on particular issues. And very important format for the Poles is the Weimar Triangle here.
Which now has been extended.
Not entirely. Let's don't push it so far yet. It is certainly true that the Weimar Triangle is a format which brings the Poles, the Germans, and the French together. And they just had a summit in Warsaw about a month ago, and an idea was being put forward to invite President Medvedev to the next summit. But it's going to be an occasional development rather than a permanent issue. So Weimar is something which is important for the Poles, perhaps more than for the Germans and the French. But it is also true that it is in this format that they want to achieve certain things, like, for example, the future of CSDP, the security and defense policy of the EU. And Eastern policy is another thing. There is an assumption in Poland that might be not accurate, and perhaps we could talk about it, that if you do achieve an agreement within this format on where the Eastern policy of the EU should be heading, it is quite likely that the EU will take this lead.
Yeah. Well, we will certainly get back to the Eastern policy and to the relationship with Russia, but before we do that, I would like to move to our fourth speaker, whom I've calling on last because he's a future colleague of mine, although it feels as though he already was a colleague. Andrew MICHTA will be, as of June 1st of this year, heading the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund. After this little infomercial, he is also a very distinguished expert in military and security affairs, teaches at Rhodes College, is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center, and has done time at the Marshall Center.
I have done
which
time
is
at the Marshall.
Not the same thing, not the same thing as the German Marshall Fund, although the two are often confused. Now, but that does bring me to my question. And you, of course, as an American of Polish origin, are again somebody with multiple fluctuating identities, like many of us. But my question is, Andrew, since you are an expert, among other things, on NATO and have been able to watch it change and shapeshift over time, to what degree is NATO still relevant for the Americans? To what degree is NATO still relevant for Europe and Central Europe? I ask the question this way on purpose, because although there has been a great deal of sort of tapping each other's shoulders about the Lisbon summit and about the new strategic concept, I think it's clear to most of us, if we're honest with each other in a room like this, as friends I think we should be, that many differences were just papered over. Again, that's the purpose of such concepts. They're not supposed to resolve differences. This is something that you do then in the context of specific issues. But in an era where threat deterrence, while still a purpose of NATO, has been joined also by the issue of risk management, which in the modern day and age is so much more complicated, makes it so much more difficult to reach agreement on things. What do you think is the residual relevance, importance of NATO? Is it just a fig leaf for the 21st century, a nice-to-have thing for the American administration when America's problems are really elsewhere, or is it still essential?
I think this is actually a very interesting segue into what I would like to do after four actually, including Madam Chairperson. Very interesting presentations, is to take a step back first, if you permit me. Because I think when you ask about the utility of NATO and you look at what we've called this panel, I think there will be a very distinct regional security optic here that will be different from, say, what you will see if you travel west past Berlin, let's assume, towards Belgium and France and other regions. One more general point that I want to make, if we are to talk about Central Europe as a kind of a security area, is that some of the problems you have here are now currently problems of European-American relations, that this is just a subset of some very specific issues, nonetheless of a larger pictures, where American priorities when it comes to NATO, for example, I would argue are basically driven by what we are engaged in, which is the current operations and especially Afghanistan. There's this tremendous, almost tunnel vision, in my view, on being able to find a resolution, being able to focus on the resources, pull resources, at a time when I want to remind everybody, I mean, we are living in a very resource-constrained environment in the United States. The subject of the last election and the subject of the upcoming presidential election, I'm convinced, will be largely domestic. That is deficit, the national debt, which is cresting at about 15 trillion. It's over 100% GDP at this point. And if you look at our policy discussions, I sometimes say to my European friends that the American lack of attention is also self-induced. I mean, we're kind of looking backwards because we have a very rich agenda at home, quite frankly. So that's the first point. Secondly, I'll be a little cheeky here, since Constanze so beautifully began with Milos. To put the region in perspective, a colleague at Columbia in 1991, I think, wrote a very short essay, which was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but drawing on an author that will be recognized here, with the title Central Europe, The Unbearable Tightness of Being, where he argued, in effect, that this region was somehow historically condemned to be either in between the great powers or peripheral to one of the powers or the other. And I took issue with my colleague at that time, and this brings me to NATO again, because I argued that, in fact, what happened in 1990, to step back from where we are today, gave this entire area, which at that time, for those of us who are at least as old as I am, materialized itself in a variety of shapes, of gray zones, of kind of lands in between, of regions of stability. Fast forward to today and see what we've accomplished, and it's truly remarkable. And NATO to me, and that's why I disagreed with my colleague at the time who wrote a very cute essay, NATO to me was one of those mechanisms to bring about institutional continuity and reassurance. And then the European Union stepped into that. And you had, in effect, even though not conditional, I know only of one speech where I think SecGen said something off the cuff that sounded like conditionality. But in effect, NATO, first step, EU, the second step, brought a degree of stability and predictability to the region that we call Central Europe today. Having said that, we have ended up, from the American perspective now, if you talk to people in Washington, in an environment that one, again, friend of mine over dinner called, this is an area of blissful normalcy, quote unquote. Meaning we essentially pay attention, but pay attention sporadically. We kind of look into the region when a crisis materializes, like Belarus. You can generate, and there are people in this audience who have worked with me on this, you can generate focus in Washington on something that's happening, and yet then focus dissipates and moves to the issues that are Afghanistan, Asia, domestic. Where does it bring me? What do I think is going to happen if this region is supposed to be construed as a separate entity? One, I see a much greater sensitivity to more traditional, historically conditioned geostrategic sensitivities. 2008, Russo-Georgian War was perceived very differently in Warsaw than it was perceived in Brussels or than it was perceived in Madrid. So that because of the burden of history, because of the geographic proximity, there was a sense that something very profound has happened. And I remember arguing in Washington at a seminar that was organized at the State Department at the time that we should not forget what this will do to the momentum on the new strategic concept. Because what happened in 2008 was perceived at least as something that was not supposed to have happened anymore in this Europe of NATO norms and EU settings and whatnot. That is, to the Central Europeans, and I'm using this term broadly, it brought a spectrum, actually a specter, of a state-on-state conflict very close to home. Once again, this looked very, very real. That was the first thing. And I think the second thing that we should keep in mind is that American engagement now in the region is going to be, and I think that's a positive development, it's going to be much more issue-driven, so to speak. And MARCIN mentioned energy, for example. I'm talking, and WESS is from Texas. So there you go, energy. Everybody's going hurrah, 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 and about shale gas, Poland, another Kuwait, and the new geostrategic environment overall. Whatever will happen, we know for a fact that there are 4 American oil companies now drilling. We know for a fact that there is tremendous interest in the potential of that. What we don't know, and I agree here completely with MARCIN, we don't know and probably won't know by our estimates until about 2012 what the results will be. Now, this is a variable that draws American attention for obvious reasons, but this is not the old issues of NATO that we have engaged in. So I apologize for going a bit too long, but I wanted to step back to say that the NATO where the East Central Europeans, now the Central Europeans are, is not the NATO where my country, I think, is today. And I think that's a fundamental thing to keep in mind.
Well, I think that did, of course, become clear in the debate about the NATO strategic concept, and it's one of the differences that was papered over, but remains with us, and I think will remain with us for the foreseeable future. Now, I know that Thomas would like to reply to MARCIN, but I would also like the two of you maybe to answer a question that I have to you, and that maybe others here in the room have as well, which is, if this is true, Andrew, what you've just said, and I think we know that it's not just Central Europeans, but including some Germans. In fact, Karl Laumer said this earlier this morning, that the war in Georgia was a wake-up call in many ways. It did make us all realize that there is a territorial threat issue out there. And it would seem to me that would actually heighten the interest in Central Europe in being a major player in the resolution of the remaining frozen conflicts. In other words, in being major players because of your proximity, your history, your cultural affinities with these countries, in actually working much more actively towards Europe whole and free. But Tomáš, first your question, but maybe you could keep that in mind.
Well, let me try to tackle both, because I think it's important to clarify first principles, so we do need to get into the question of whether there is Central Europe, and MARCIN seemed to hint that there isn't, so I do want to get into that. But perhaps in a second, let me tackle this second question first. Are the Central Europeans neglecting their own security by not tackling frozen conflicts in their neighborhoods? I think we're far more realistic in our ability to fundamentally change Russia's view and role in places like Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course Crimea and other places. If France and the United States haven't succeeded, it isn't obvious to me how sort of combined Central European efforts could bring to a substantive change to Crimea, Transnistria, or other frozen conflicts. That's why our response to 2008, rather than trying to go out and try to resolve the sort of inbuilt time bombs in Eastern Europe, has been to frankly seek reassurances. Let's be quite honest about it. That was an important part of the debate on the strategic concept. The lesson we took from 2008 is that the security of Central and Eastern Europe is by no means a dumb business in terms of negating and erasing future threats. There are very real security concerns out there, and we would like to know that what is it that NATO has in place and in store if one of those things materialize. And much to the credit of NATO, much to the credit of the present U.S. administration, a lot of the work on it has been done since. Of course, contingency plans for NATO, I believe 5 military exercises that the United States has held in the Baltic in 2010 alone have helped an awful lot. But in my response to your second question, it's not about the frozen conflicts. I don't think Central Europeans will flatter themselves to think that we can change fundamentally Russia's view on the frozen conflicts. And unless that changes, I don't see how any of the frozen conflicts can successfully be resolved. Our response to 2008 is to tighten our bonds with NATO, and it's been done successfully.
It's interesting that you should say that. I mean, my experience as a Western European has been that small countries, small powers in Europe can have an inordinate amount of influence, much larger than they think. But perhaps somebody in the audience would later like to take that up. MARCIN, would you like to respond?
To be part on Georgia or to be part on Central Europe?
As you wish, really, both. I think they belong together.
On Central Europe, I mean, I do think that Central Europe certainly exists in both cultural sense, and it does also exist in terms of what we are really interested in. As I said, you know, the way this conference looks, it would have looked very differently in any other part of Europe. But it could look exactly the same way in Warsaw. Except organization is better here, of course. Yeah.
We won't pass that on to Warsaw.
Off the record.
Yeah. But But it also doesn't mean necessarily that we always, there are certain issues that we get on and we can really achieve results in the format of V4, for example, climate. This was something that you had an effective coalition that the rest of the EU didn't like, but it was good for our interests. But, for example, we didn't manage to get coalition on visas, which is hugely important in our Eastern policy. And there are also divisions on the issue of how to proceed, for example, with Belarus and Eastern Partnership. Yeah? However, it is us who are interested in it, and those in the, for example, in Rome or Portugal are not even aware about the notion of Eastern Partnership. So, you know, it is really...
Which is where Central Europe could play a real role.
Exactly.
In bringing along some of Western Europe.
Exactly. And as regards Georgia, I think the lessons are yet to be digested. I think I agree with Thomas that the fact that we were seeking reassurance was somehow prompted by the Georgia war. But I thought that, you know, we would have sought it anyway. You know, it is a very standard Central European appeal to want to have, you know, to stress the importance of Article 5, which is very much misunderstood in the rest of the EU. For us, it's essential. This is what NATO is about, really. But other lessons that we could also draw from that is that, you know, that war happened there, and the rest of the West was powerless. The rest of the West could do nothing about that. The Russians pushed, and they called the bluff, and nothing happened. So perhaps the fact that you have a series of rapprochements happening with Russia in the region is also related to the fact that perhaps some in Central Eastern Europe, you know, realize that we cannot entirely rely on NATO, the US, and so on.
Of course, some of us would be a little more reassured about those rapprochements if at the same time we were seeing real movement on Moldova, Transnistria that is, Nagorno-Karabakh and others of the frozen conflicts. The question is, what are you getting for the rapprochement? Are you just getting, and that's important enough, Russian cooperation in Afghanistan on Iran sanctions, and maybe one or two other issues, which are certainly at the top of the American agenda and are equally important for Europe at this time. But are you also getting cooperation and real movement on the issues that are closer to Europe? And that's the frozen conflicts in the eastern neighborhood. Let me move quickly to WESS again. We were talking earlier, as we were preparing for this panel, about the way that the United States treats Central Europe and the EU in general. And there's been quite a lot of development there. I mean, we are a far cry from the times when Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was talking about old Europe and new Europe. And then we all know that he later referred to this himself as "that's so old Rumsfeld." But these days, it's a little hard to see how Washington wants to play its relationship with Europe. It seems to be doing everything at the same time. Telling the Europeans, look, we are really tired of summits where we have to shake the hands of 27 leaders. Our president's arms just get exhausted from that. At the same time, it seems that the Americans are quite happy to play the bilateral relationships up when that is necessary on an issue basis, as you said, Andrew. Is this useful for Is this useful America? And I would like to ask you, is this useful for Central Europe?
Well, I think if you look at Europe on the global geopolitical map from the perspective of the Obama administration, I don't think it's unkind to say that Europe has never been a high priority for this administration. And to the extent that it's invested energies, you know, in the period since the cancellation of missile defense, it's been to kind of tie off a loose domestic political flank. I think the problem for this administration in some ways is that we have a policy and a clear set of objectives for U.S. policy with Russia, but not clear U.S. policy for the 30-odd countries between the Atlantic and Russia. So I think looking at it from a U.S. perspective, I mean, typically what you've seen, at least in the first year or so of the Obama administration, if you're looking at Central Europe, is a cluster of small and mid-sized states that have helped the United States in previous engagements. That this administration, I think, made the calculation fairly early on. We're not going to make a large contribution to any of its main aims. I also think the Obama administration sees itself, probably wrongly, as sort of in somehow having this historic role of being the first administration to navigate global multipolarity. And so they're more interested in great power openings and great power reset and détente-style relationships. And I think that what that means, I think there's a lot of good work to be done in cooperation with larger powers. But I think small and mid-sized allies of the United States globally are reassessing their strategic menu cards. There's not a clear understanding of where they fit in U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's a very dangerous moment in geopolitical history to be sending those signals.
Yeah.
Constanze, could I,
Yeah, please.
if I may pick up on something that Marcin said, which struck me, which is very interesting in this conversation, about the Polish perception of the Georgia War. And if I quote you correctly here, that basically the Russians called the West's bluff and nothing happened. I agree with you up to that point. Actually, a lot happened. There was pressure and there were consequences. And I want to bring one more dimension to the discussion as to why I believe the United States appears at times disengaged from the NATO alliance. That is that they're almost like the parallel tracks, if you will. There's on the one hand the new strategic concept, which is negotiated over time. The wise men meet, the wise women meet, the wise, the process goes on. Hands are shaken, signatures are delivered. And then there is a second track, which is a de facto demilitarization of Europe. I mean, let's look at the defense budgets and let's be honest about it. So from the point of view of the U.S. defense planner, looking at what's going on this side of the spectrum, they're almost two virtual universes, so to speak. On the one hand, all these things are supposed to happen. On the other hand, I think Switzerland will have more tanks than Germany, whatever's going to end up happening. Just a kind of an anecdotal throw-out. My point is, I believe that the progressive disengagement on the U.S. so-called hard security side, when it comes to looking at Europe, is the kind of declining level of confidence in the utility what the European allies bring to the table. Those in Central Europe who are close to the periphery, I would argue, feel it, know it, and they're trying to learn from it. And I think that the kind of level of discussion right now that you have, like in your country, Marcin, about the size of the Polish army that's required, the $20,000 reserve that you have to have, and all that kind of stuff. That's a response to it. And I will conclude on one thing. When the fourth seminar of the new strategic concept, Madeleine Albright debate was taking place in Washington, I will never forget two things that I found striking. One was at NDU in the audience, the number of senior European officers of flag rank and the number of American officers in uniform. I counted 6 on our side. One, I think, was 1-star, the rest were 06s. On the European side, there was full representation, which you could say people were doing other things, was completely accidental. But what struck me at the end was a speech delivered by a senior American defense official who said in conclusion, quote, if you don't resource your defense, our European friends, then this new strategic concept will not be worth the paper it's written on. Have a nice day. That was basically the message delivered at the end. So my concern is that what we're trying to fine-tune here and kind of finagle and find is the region really a region? Is it interacting with America in this or that fashion? I think from Washington, those entry points are becoming blunter and blunter, if you will, because there's a perception that the utility is less and less.
Well, certainly Secretary of Defense Gates' speech was nothing if not blunt. With all
I didn't
this,
say that.
with all this, I would like to turn now to questions from the audience. And we actually, well, you may not be aware that we have a larger audience than is in this room, because I've just been given a question from Facebook. And it's for Tomáš WALÁŠek from Peter Pinjak at the University of Pittsburgh, and I think there's a good guess that he might be Slovak as well. And the question is, Slovakia has recently faced increasing criticism for continual decrease in its defense spending. Do you think that this defense spending crisis will eventually alter the Slovak role within Central Europe as well as within the transatlantic community? Thank you.
The answer is yes, and not just our role, but the same. There was about 3 or 4 other countries in the region that are going through the same difficulties. I mean, just to put numbers on it, the Slovak defense budget has gone, I think, through 40% reduction over the past 3 years. That sounds dramatic. That's nothing compared to Latvia, which has cut defense budgets by 50% in 2-year periods between 2008 2010. There's 2 or 3 countries within Central and Eastern Europe that are either on the cusp of or have already gone below spending 1% of GDP on defense. By my last count, Romania was at about 0.81 and Hungary was approaching 0.86. So not only are we not spending the 2% of GDP that, of course, NATO loosely expects of its allies, we're spending actually less than 1. Is that an issue? Absolutely. As I argued earlier, because the old agenda, making Europe whole and free, isn't dominating the usual relations anymore, the strength of a transatlantic relationship today is being measured by how successfully can Central Europeans, other Europeans contribute to the new agenda. That includes Afghanistan. And I don't see how cutting a defense budget to below 1%, you can contribute at the same level as you did when you had 2% or so before. Having said that, the starting position, and of course I would say so as a Central European, but it is a fact and it bears mentioning. The starting point was actually pretty favorable to Central Europe. When you look at the number of countries, the countries that contribute the most troops to Afghanistan on a per capita basis, you'll find 3 Central European countries among the top 6 contributors, Poland, Estonia, and Latvia. So if there are countries in Europe that are doing their share, by and large, it tended to be Central Europeans. But I just don't see how we can continue that trend and at the same time slash defense budgets dramatically. Can I take this 2 years forward and pose a broader question, which is, what I said is true in a sense that our defense budget cuts, and if we have to come to it, decreases in contributions to Afghanistan will reflect badly will play badly in Washington. My question to the 2 American panelists, sorry to reserve your power as a chairperson, is what happens 2 or 3 years from now when we do withdraw from Afghanistan and this common mission goes away? By what metric will we then measure contributions? What will be the substance of a relationship then? We're not going to be of particularly great help or particularly decisive in places like China or India. So if Afghanistan goes, how will that shape your expectations and a relationship in general?
Perhaps this is where the moderator would like to make a small editorializing insertion, which is that it's worth keeping in mind, and I think this will resonate with many people in this room, just how far the Europeans had to go in defense transformation after the end of the Cold War. And this is true for my own country, which was rather unusually configured to spend most of what would be a war with Russia inside its own borders for three weeks, after which we would have the onset of nuclear war and it wouldn't matter anyway. But of course, the Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans had to oversee the transformation of huge, heavy, old-fashioned communist armies, in which, by the way, NATO played in my view, undersung role. It was incredibly important for NATO to help oversee the demobilization of these armies. And I don't just mean technically, I mean socially, as a social phenomenon. That was a huge achievement. But we've already come a very large way, and the social and political transformational costs of those processes, I think, are sometimes undervalued in other areas of the world. I would also like to, again, this is slightly editorializing, I'd also like to remind us that some of the Eastern European countries were persuaded to buy things after 1989 that turned out not to be terribly useful for them. I'm thinking of particularly large quantities of fighter planes. Fighter planes are not all that important these days. I mean, I'm not dissing any of your fighter planes. If you have any personally, they're beautiful things. But in terms of forward-looking defense planning, it's iffy whether you actually needed that many. And remember that the Czechs got out of their contracts because of the floods. In other words, it hasn't been easy, and not all of it. And in some ways, we've been hampered in ways that we shouldn't have been hampered. But with that, I'm going to turn to the first question from the audience, and I will ask you the following. I won't take your microphones away from you, but I would ask you can make a comment or a question, but be brief and introduce yourselves at the beginning, because not everybody knows everybody.